Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our latest Oxford Sparks Facebook Live event, where we ask the questions you want to know from the researchers from the University of Oxford. Today, we're joined by Harriet and Victoria, who are researchers in the Interdisciplinary Centre for Conservation Scientists, to talk to them about all things conservation. Well, I guess, first of all, we probably should ask, what is conservation about?
Well, conservation is the act of preventing biodiversity loss. And when people think about biodiversity, they generally think about species such as blue whales. But actually, it's more than just that. It ranges from the genetic makeup of the species, so genetic diversity, to the actual species themselves, to the habitats and ecosystems in which they live.
So there's lots of different ways we can do conservation as well. So there's the management of an area or a habitat. So for example, in the UK, lots of meadows are managed specifically for certain species. There's also, we can tackle the challenges and the threats to biodiversity. So just thinking of one, invasive species, which are animals that live in habitats where they're not supposed to be. So for example, in the Galapagos, a lot of effort has gone into removing rats from islands in order to protect snakes that live there. And there's also restoration as well, so trying to make habitats back to what they were before humans came along and disrupted them. So for example, in Scotland, lots of the habitat there, where it was once traditionally forest, has been overgrazed, and so groups are trying to restore the forest by fencing off areas and replanting trees.
Great. You mentioned the word biodiversity there quite a bit. Why should we care? Why is it important?
Well, biodiversity is important in terms of its ecosystem services that it provides to humans. And these services are really important for humans' well-being. So some of the services that we get from biodiversity include provisioning services, which are things like food and raw materials that we get. There are also regulating services, so forests help with climate regulation, wetlands help with water purification. And then also there's spiritual and cultural values that everyone has associated with biodiversity. So everyone enjoys recreation, everyone enjoys going and being with nature, but there are also spiritual values. So some communities believe that various entities contain spirits that they worship.
And also there's an intrinsic right to protect biodiversity for itself. Like it's a thing, and we have an ethical obligation to care for other things in this world. So there's also that component as well.
And also economically it's important. Tourism, biodiversity tourism contributes a lot to countries' economies. Yeah.
Great. And obviously this is important around the globe, and I believe you guys work all over the place. So can you tell us a bit about the specific sort of research that you're working on?
Yeah, so with our group and ICCS, like all of us, we do some work in the UK, but most of us work overseas, often in developing countries where biodiversity is highest and also most threatened. So for example, I work in Cambodia in a tropical forest, and I'm looking at snare hunting So a snare is a kind of trap that is commonly used throughout the tropics. So my research involves lots of walking through forests, lots of climbing through bamboo with everything tucked in so that insects don't get in, and also talking to hunters as well, and talking to local people about their actions, about what they do, about why they do it, in order to improve how we can manage protected areas and how we can better protect biodiversity, and also how we can better protect their livelihoods and the resources that they get from nature.
So that's a lot of sort of talking to people, monitoring what's going on, what's changing, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely, and trying to understand. These are very, very complex systems that change with lots of different factors affect how they act. So yeah, it's trying to get into the nitty-gritty of that and really trying to understand it.
And my project focuses more on sustainable development. So I'm looking at ways in which you can have economic development, but at the same time protect biodiversity and safeguard local communities' livelihoods and rights. So So I'm actually working on quite a contentious project in Uganda. It revolves around a large hydropower dam, the Bujagali hydropower project, which was funded by the World Bank. And the World Bank stipulated that some conservation activities needed to take place in order to compensate for the damage that the dam did to the environment. And so I'm having a look at the impact that this dam has had on local people, on their livelihoods. Maybe they've benefited, maybe they've got employment, perhaps they've lost access to natural resources now. A lot of them along the river rely on the river for fishing and sand mining. And I'm also having a look at the impacts that some of the conservation activities have. So if you replace biodiversity that's been destroyed in another area, those local communities are going to lose access to this natural resource. So how then is that going to affect their livelihoods?
So is it about looking at where you can maybe move those resources elsewhere to compensate? Sorry, I think you said.
Yeah, so essentially it's this topic called biodiversity offsetting. So in simplest terms, if you destroy 10 hectares of biodiversity in one area, you then go and restore or rehabilitate or replant 10 hectares in another area. But with this movement in biodiversity, if you've got a community relying on natural resources in one area and suddenly you remove that, it's going to have a large social impact on them. And of course, the ones in the second area are going to be benefiting because they're going to be getting more natural resources. So we're coming about looking at how to protect this biodiversity, but at the same time safeguard these local communities.
Great. So there's this bit in the title of your centre, Interdisciplinary Centre for Conservation Science. I think you've kind of already touched on it just a little bit, but can we explore who you're working with?
Yeah, so I guess at the top level, we're working with lots of different people. So we're working with other academics, and they might be academics with economic backgrounds or from social science backgrounds or psychology. We're working with computer scientists as well. So people with lots of different and ecological and biological backgrounds as well, obviously. So that's what the interdisciplinary means. We're working with people from different scientific backgrounds to draw on their expertise and strengthen the work that we do. And then also we're working with NGOs, which, you know, they do much of the work across the world on which we're looking at. So it's really important to engage them. We also work with government,
businesses, the private sector, but also most importantly, we work with local leaders and the local communities so that we empower them and they have a voice as well.
So they're fully involved and collaborate with your projects?
The local communities. Yeah, so I would say not always collaborate, but they're always involved in our projects. So usually we want to find out how they rely on the natural resources, or in my case, what the impacts are. So we always engage with them.
And does working with such a broad and varied group of people, does that make things quite a lot more difficult, or is it really interesting and exciting? Like, how do you find that?
Actually, interesting.
It's really one of the really great things about what we get to do. You get to meet so many people and learn so many skills, and improve the work that you do. So I think it's a really, it's an incredible benefit of being able to work.
Yeah, like I'm currently learning about an economic method, which I never thought I'd learn about. So it's really exciting, actually.
Great. If you've just joined us, we're here with Harriet and Victoria from the Interdisciplinary Centre for Conservation Science, talking about all things conservation, the research that they're doing, and here to ask your questions. And we have a question, so I'll just bring this in now, if that's okay. They've asked, is education of people to appreciate biodiversity an important part of your work for now and in the future?
Yeah, definitely. There are quite a few NGOs out there who do work on education in schools, but I think that's something we really like about the animation that we've done, actually. It's a great outreach. It's a way of reaching the general public, people who don't always know about conservation, don't necessarily know about the research that we're doing. Education is a really big part. We also like working with the local communities as well, teaching them about the value of biodiversity, but also, interestingly, they educate us. So they're the ones who tell us why the biodiversity is important, why they think they should protect it.
I would say most importantly is we don't necessarily do the activities ourselves, but we look at how we can do them better. and understanding how we can communicate the messages better, how we can change behaviour in order to improve biodiversity loss. So that's a really important aspect, is learning how we can do something better in order to spread those messages and work with NGOs that do the actual intervention.
So stick with us, but once you've finished watching this, do go to our channel, Oxford Sparks channel on YouTube, and you'll be able to find this animation, which gives a really nice overview about what this research is all about. Well, the next question I wanted to ask is about what actually drives, you've covered it kind of an overview, but sort of specifics about what drives human behaviour towards their environment. So
behaviour change and understanding why people do things is kind of central to what we do. We've got no chance of changing people's behaviour and reversing the decline in biodiversity if we don't understand why people are doing things. And part of that is also understanding who and how and when and what they're doing as well. So, for example, for biodiversity, for looking at behaviour change, thinking about my research, which is looking at hunting in Cambodia, a really strong part of what we're trying to do is understand why people hunt. So is it because they don't have enough money and they're going out to hunt to get meat that they can't afford to buy, or is it because meat's not available to them? There's no market or there's no road to deliver access. So trying to think about, okay, so what could be a solution to that? Is it that we need to think about ways to improve their income, or is it ways that we need to improve access? Or is it that people are hunting because actually they just prefer the taste of wild meat? Like, we don't know. So trying to understand that, and if that's the case, then how can we work with them to maybe change the perception around that? We also really need to think about how the things that we do might affect their behaviour in the future. So, for example, if we were to bring in sources of income or better access to meat, will that actually change their future behaviour? Will that mean that there's less hunting, or will it mean that people just have more income to go and buy better hunting equipment to go and kill more animals? So we don't know. So this is a really important part of what we do, trying to work out why people do things, the motivations, and then how that behaviour might change under different scenarios as well.
So it's kind of action research, as in you're trying out these different, is that where you're trying out different things and seeing the effect, or do you use other methods?
Yeah, so occasionally you might, we will work with an NGO, we would never do it ourselves, but an NGO might be putting in an intervention, so we'd go and survey before the intervention, and then they might do it, and then we might see how the situation has changed after the intervention, or we can use specific methods to see how, under hypothetical scenarios, people might change their behaviour. So if we were to do this, what would you do then? Would you do this, this, or this? So there's various research techniques that we can use to try and understand that behaviour.
And with the project that you're working on in Uganda, I take it that the dam is built or is going to be built, and so really what you're trying to do is learn for the future.
Yeah, exactly. So the dam was finished in about 2012. So we're really looking at ways in which we can improve the biodiversity conservation and the local communities. But also there's a new dam that's being built downstream called the Isimba Dam, and so a lot of the lessons learned that we're learning from the Bujagali Dam can actually be transferred to Isimba. But in general, part of my research and part of the wider project that I'm working on is to generate some lessons learned for Uganda. They're also currently updating their national environmental legislation, so some of the research will help with that and a new set of guidelines on biodiversity offsetting. So we're working with some NGO partners, the Wildlife Conservation Society, who are sort of spearheading this update. And we're making sure that the social impacts are included in this new legislation. And also we want to generate a set of international lessons so that people doing offsetting in different parts of the world can actually start learning about how to include social considerations.
Great. We've got another question in, which I'll just ask now. They ask, is it a difficult balance between using biodiversity for today's daily survival needs and the needs to protect ecosystems for the future? So I think this gets down to how much we understand and can model future effects, future ecosystems, or is it very much in the here and now that your research is more focused on?
I mean, conservation is kind of a crisis discipline as such. We are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. So, I mean, at the moment it's trying to do what we can to stop biodiversity loss, and then it's looking for the future. But obviously think we don't know how the climate change and all of these factors in the future are going to change biodiversity. So it's about both ultimately. Like you've got the short term, but ultimately any action that you do should be for the long term in order.
And I think that's why we do a lot of ecological modelling as well, to try and look at trends in biodiversity, try and model if we use one sort of implementation, if we implement one activity, what might happen in the future. So yeah, there's a lot of modelling involved.
So it's quite a big, vast and complicated picture, I think, is what we're getting for that. And so in relation to how you're doing your research and working with local communities, someone's asked, what do you do to disseminate information back to communities once you have completed your research? Or is it kind of an ongoing?
Yeah, so that's something that's really important to most of us, or everyone at ICCS, and something when I was in Uganda, a lot of the communities actually asked, we're giving you this information, what are we going to get in return? So we're very careful about not building expectations, so you can't go in and say, we're going to change and build you a borehole. So we go back and we explain to them that it's going to take us a while, we're going to analyse our data, but then we go back and we do feedback meetings with them. So we'll hold a stakeholder meeting with everybody in the village. We might have focus group discussions perhaps if there are some vulnerable groups that aren't included in the wider meeting. And we'll also engage with local leaders so that they understand sort of the impact that our research and our results are going to have.
So it's kind of traditional face-to-face, nothing better than sitting down face-to-face with people. Great. So it sounds really interesting. You travel, speak to people, different people in different fields. But how did you get into this field of research? Why are you here?
Well, I guess for me and probably for most people working in the sector, it's kind of just an innate love of nature and being outdoors. So when I was young, I was one of those people that was always outside playing in the mud, like digging up worms and stuff like that. And, you know, when I was growing up, I was lucky enough to be from a very outdoorsy family. So we were always out in the Peak District, like climbing or bouldering, that kind of thing. And then as I was growing up more, I went to a school where I was given the opportunity to go and volunteer in Malawi from when I was 16, which is an amazing opportunity. And from there I saw development in action, and also I got to go on safari as well. So that kind of really planted my seed for my love for Africa, for the wildlife there, for the people, and also for the need to think about others in this world. And so from there it's just kind of continued. So I did a degree in environmental geography and international development, with the aim of always wanting to work in conservation. And so, yeah, it's just kind of continued from there, and I've done lots of volunteering in order to get where I am, and I've done a master's in conservation science recently. So kind of, yeah, it's just an innate love of nature, being outdoors, just, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, for me it was also very similar. I grew up in Lesotho and South Africa, so I've always been surrounded by biodiversity and some amazing game reserves. And as a family, we would always go to game reserves a couple of times a year. And that was from a young age. So I started out actually wanting to be a bit of a wildlife vet.
I wanted to be a vet too.
Yeah. But strangely enough, I thought 7 years was too long to study, and here I'm doing a DPhil. So. Anyway, back to it. So, yeah, I've always loved wildlife and the outdoors and the environment. So it led me to do a BSc degree in biodiversity and ecology in South Africa. And it was after that I realized I was getting very specific into zoology, and particularly conservation genetics, so preserving the genetic diversity of small mammals. And then I joined a company, an engineering company, and I started working in the mining sector. And I really loved that. And it was through that it showed me the social impacts that development can have and how important people are to protecting biodiversity, but also the need to protect them as well. So I think that got me really interested in the social aspects of conservation. And that's what led me to do a DPhil now with ICCS.
And so if there are any young people out there, or anyone really who's just keen to get involved, like what would your top tips, your advice be for them?
So for me, how I got involved with conservation is I was doing my Duke of Edinburgh award and I needed to do a voluntary activity. And my mum was like, why don't you just go along to the local conservation group? So I used to go along on a Sunday morning with a group of old men and lots of, I think they were actually doing from prisons doing rehabilitation work. So I used to go along with them and chop down trees and then replant them and then make habitat piles and things like that. And then from there it just kind of escalated, if that's the right word. And then I joined my local wildlife trust, which are a great organisation for getting out there, and they do lots of work with children as well, lots of children's groups and lots of monitoring as well. So it pretty much started from there, and without that experience I wouldn't have been able to get into the place where I am now.
So just getting stuck in and volunteering with local groups.
Yeah, and there are also, if you wanted to make a small difference, there are little things that you can do in your day-to-day life. For example, recycling. It might seem very basic, but it makes a difference. Just being aware of the products that you're using. So, for example, making sure that you're using things that have certified palm oil. Making sure that there's no plastic in your face scrubs. And if you're already doing all of that, then nag a friend and ask them to do it as well. But I would say volunteering is a great way to get involved.
I mean, that kind of leads on to a question about this kind of almost seems a little bit far away for many of us, you know, biodiversity and things like that. We don't all have to catch our own food or for our livelihoods. Most of us, we don't have to. But yeah, so basically in terms of what the rest of us can do to help with conservation, it really is just that kind of having awareness and little things in our behaviour.
Yeah, and I think the really important thing to remember is that everyone can be a conservationist. It's not just because we work here, it doesn't mean we're isolated or we're any less of a conservation or more of a conservationist than you. Like, everyone can do little things that can help to protect the environment and the world that we live in every single day. So just, you know, whether it's turning off a light or taking a reusable bag instead of getting a plastic bag, taking a drinks bottle instead of a reusable bottle, that's one less piece of plastic that's going to end up in the oceans, and that's one less animal that's going to eat that plastic and die from it in their stomach. So, you know, everyone can do something, and even if it's just, you know, walking or biking to work instead of driving, it's just the really simple things, and I think that's the really important thing to remember. You know, start off simple. Not everyone has to go out and get knees deep in mud. You just have to just think a little bit more about what you do. And yeah, you can make a difference that way. And if everyone made that one little thing, then it's a big collective action that can change things.
Small actions, big impacts. Well, we've got a question about what you can do with the defill once you've finished. But what I would say is keep on asking those questions on the Facebook page. I think we have to wrap up now, sadly. But perhaps you can answer that question on Facebook. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you very much for sharing your stories. Don't forget to go and watch our animation. It's on our YouTube page. So if you just go to YouTube and search Oxford Sparks, you'll find us. It's fantastic. And yeah, we'll be back at some point with another Facebook Live. So do follow our Facebook page and keep up to date. Thanks.
Thank you.